In 2009, EA developers Amir Rao and Gavin Simon quit their jobs on the Command & Conquer series and moved into Rao's dad's house to make their own game. They then hired artist Gen Z and musician Darren Korb, and so Supergiant Games was born. Two more of Rao's personal friends, Greg Kasavin and Andrew Wang, then signed on to help develop, and Korb's good friend Logan Cunningham joined along with him as voice talent. And then, that's it. They called in some favors through the dev process, but at its core, officially speaking, 7 people made Bastion. 7 people built Supergiant from the ground up, from a couple of former EA grunts in an actual San Jose living room to the most respected indie developer, if not developer hard stop, in the games industry. And even if I'm wrong, and somehow, by some act, they're still not at the top of the mountain, I can prove to you, right here and now, that they absolutely should be. If you were to put a gun to my head right now at the start of the video and ask me, what's the secret ingredient? Why doesn't Supergiant miss? First, I'd tell you to just sit through the video I just made, but I tend to crack under pressure, so if you just cocked the gun, I'd probably spill that I think it's that nobody leaves. As far as I can tell, literally nobody has ever stopped working for Supergiant. And while that doesn't mean much in and of itself, 12 years and no official turnover, it's a big couple of puzzle pieces when you break it down. Firstly, there's the raw talent. When you have a great team for one project and none of them go off to lead their own team or do their own thing or whatever, the next project also automatically has a great team. That's just it. It's not very complicated. A bit of this is luck, but Supergiant was built on connections, overachievers from around the industry, recommended through friends. In a sense, Supergiant's story is a feel-good American dream type about passionate people taking risks. But the reality is a certain amount of risk can always be eliminated by just being really fucking good at stuff, which all these guys are. Management knows the talent they've collected, and it's just not worth it to let that talent go. So they make it hard to go. In a good way, obviously. Supergiant makes one game at a time, start to finish. Their staff is full-time, well-paid, and very well taken care of. Take it from a contracted grunt. Glory is for suckers. The wise man values healthcare and PTO. Which leads me to the second benefit of zero turnover. Culture. There's this great bit in H-Bomber Guy's video about Deus Ex Human Revolution where he tries to explain just how difficult the process of making on-the-fly creative choices can be in a modern AAA development pipeline. So many middlemen, so much red tape, so much time and money lost just to get approval from all the right signatures. These guys used to just lean over the couch and ask. And while that can be said about any indie game, that culture has remained as Supergiant has grown into an actual studio. There's still only like 20-something of them. At most, it's a brisk walk across the office. When your employer says you're like a family, what they mean is your new partner is a lazy nepotism hire and he's gonna break your entire filing system within the week. When Supergiant says it, you're inclined to believe them. They've been working together for over 10 years, and interviews would suggest their studio is a surprisingly democratic place. When there's problems, when there's creative differences, there's no Cold Wars. They have civil, but very, very hot wars in the Supergiant office. Only the best ideas survive the crucible. Happy employees who feel respected do better work, and at the end of the day, Supergiant at least presents as the ideal creative environment. That's basically how come they're so good at making video games. But on top of that, the third member of the proverbial Triforce is kind of both talent and culture at once. It's consistency. Supergiant doesn't just have a talented team. They don't just get along, they know each other, like in italics. The more you work with someone, the more you understand them. Their strengths, their flaws, their creative outlook. What over a decade of this company only adding voices has done is refine the workflow, maximize every team member's contributions, and breed innovation. Supergiant evolves with every game, without ever losing the foundational elements that make their games feel so uniquely Supergiant. But that's real easy to say. So let's take a walk back through their catalog, understand what uniquely Supergiant really means, and hopefully come out the other side with a new perspective on the creative process. Obviously, this means absolutely comprehensive spoilers for every Supergiant game. I'll add a time code to skip to if you want to miss like one game, but for the most part, I'm assuming you already know the stories, or at least think you can enjoy the games even if you have the plot spoiled, which you definitely can because all these games fucking rule. Now, the story of Supergiant games can be summed up adequately in a singular question. What do we want to do now? Not next, not to capitalize on this. Now, which as a corporate ethos is about as Chad as it gets, but it also means that each Supergiant game is a reactive creation. And so, it's safe to say that Bastion, as their first game, is Supergiant in its purest form. And by that, I mean it was made on a budget of pocket change and free meals and cobbled together along the way with duct tape and the power of believing. Kind of like the world it's set in. In fact, the question that sums up Bastion posed by Rao himself was simply, what if there was an action RPG where you can build the whole world yourself? This heightened sense of interactivity, outside-the-box concept of player-driven storytelling, would become the creative foundation of every Supergiant game. But in the case of Bastion, it was actually mostly a practical decision. Bastion is the story of the kid, a kid who wakes up one day and discovers his entire country has been blown the fuck up. The calamity has destroyed nearly everything, leaving only random floating bits of land and ashen impressions of his countrymen. The first thing you'll notice, though, is that the world is still, oddly enough, very beautiful. Why, you ask? Because the art came first is why. They didn't want a map, so the map had to build itself. And they wanted an isometric camera, so they put the sky on the ground. They wanted it to be enticing, so Gen Z redesigned the entire world to be very pretty and fit together perfectly. Bastion was built on vibes, almost literally. In addition to the art, the music was also produced far before the actual game was built out properly, leading to a sort of backward-level design philosophy that gives priority to the atmosphere. This is another of Supergiant's trademarks, their aesthetic cohesion, and it was born mainly out of necessity. Speaking of, the second thing you'll notice as the kid makes his way to the Bastion, the nationwide rendezvous point for any emergency, is that the narrator is obviously not the kid, and he reacts to everything you do. So who is he? Well, he's Logan Cunningham, obviously, they only had one voice actor, but he's also Rux, an old guy who just happened to survive. This was not the original plan either. Bastion was always envisioned as an action RPG, but the problem with that is which goes where. Bastion's gameplay moves pretty fast, the world literally builds itself before you, and stopping for conversation in the semi-apocalypse would be not only logically jarring, but practically too. And they would be goddamned if they made you listen to audio logs. So came to be Rux, an old guy whose only real job is to have been alive long enough to remember stuff, and Logan Cunningham's gruff yet buttery voice does the rest of the heavy lifting. It always comes back to this idea of you truly telling the story, putting the active in interactive. I mean, yeah, Rux is telling the kid's story, but he reacts to your decisions as the player. You literally only get out of it what you put in, and beautiful artwork, genre-transcendent soundtrack, and generally solid gameplay aside, I know that's noticeably less of a compliment, I'll get to it, the storytelling style is what made Bastion a hit. So the actual story is what I was at one point talking about, and I won't be for long, but just let me finish the premise. Rux sends the kid out into the fractured countryside to collect these glowing MacGuffins called cores, the very power cores that used to run their city. They can power the Bastion too, and help them rebuild. There's your premise, and it's where the core gameplay loop comes in, so let's get to that. Here's my hot take on Bastion. I don't think, personally, that the gameplay is especially fun. What it is solid, serviceable, and surprisingly varied. Bastion is a basic isometric action game. It was built for the Xbox Arcade, so every button does one thing: dodge, block, weapon 1, weapon 2 special. Enemies pop up as you go along the map, and as far as gameplay goes, you basically just follow the line and kill anything that's actively in your way. It's not a super deep system, but there are a lot of weapons and upgrades, and the base building mechanics in the Bastion give you a lot of space to optimize it the way you want. As you collect cores, you build more of the Bastion, unlocking more customization options and lore museums, adding some pets for flavor, and finding more trial grounds to pick up cool special attacks. There are, in fact, 12 different weapons in the game, and there's no distinction between primary and secondary weapons, which means technically, there's at least 132 different ways to play this game, not including specials. That's a big number, but frankly, it doesn't mean very much. Bastion's not a super hard game. The weapons basically just fall into ranged and melee with mild variations in speed and AoE pattern. The enemies are incredibly, almost comically easy to cheese, and while you absolutely can choose to challenge yourself, I just wanted to get to the story, honestly. And most people will, I would think. This isn't necessarily a flaw. Again, this game was built almost backwards, and the deceptive simplicity of combat actually gives you more opportunity to appreciate the spectacular art and music and little details. But I don't think this was on purpose, so I don't really feel right praising it. It's a cheap, simple game, one designed to fit into the pocket-sized files on the Xbox Arcade, be easy to port on the PC, and essentially prove the worth of Supergiant games. And that it absolutely does, thanks mostly to the story. So let's get back to that before you realize I'm just too bad at video games to intelligently analyze gameplay. Along your travels, collecting the cores, you will meet Zulf and Zia, two survivors of the Aura people, the other race in this world. The kids' people, but not the kids specifically, have been to war with them in the past. Why, yes, there are still racial tensions, thank you for asking. But it's basically the end of the world, and all their friends are dead, so they might as well come to the Bastion too. Surely, no problems will come of this later. Obvious things aside, the levels where you meet these two are both absolutely gorgeous, wordless portrayals of cataclysmic trauma. And you do pretty quickly come to care for them, but yes, against all narrative odds, Zulf betrays you and destroys the Bastion. You see, you were the bad guys all along, sort of, as the journals you collect prove that your people forced Zia's father to build an apocalyptic weapon to ethnically cleanse the Aura, and he sabotaged it, which is what caused the cataclysm. Pretty terrible, but not necessarily the kid or even Rux's fault. And it's certainly not helping anything to break the giant restoration machine. Bit of a petulant child, that Zulf, but don't worry, he'll get what's coming to him. The kid now has to run around collecting busted shards of the cores to fix the Bastion again, and oops, oh no, the Aura come and break it again, and also, if you're not fast enough, kill some of your pets, which, what the absolute shit, Supergiant? Who signed off on that? Amir, was that you? Gavin? Greg? Which of you hates adorable animals? Jesus. Unnecessary is what it was. Anyway, restart again, fix it one last time. Oh, and the bastards kidnapped Zia, so go rescue her, just kicking Aura ass all up and down their equally shattered homeland. And as it turns out, the Bastion can allegedly undo the calamity. So as the kid heads to the heart of the Aura's territory, he finds, well, they've already gone and beaten hell out of poor Zulf for incurring the wrath of this child with a hammer, and they're gonna kill him. This is where the first real Supergiant choice, TM, comes into play. Supergiant's really very, very good at choices, small and large, and this one matters. Not to the game, to you. You can choose, in this moment, to abandon Zulf. Say, you, sir, you dumb idiot who chose revenge over repair, deserve to be killed by the people you stole that decision from. Or you can choose to forgive him, to understand the trauma he suffered, the namelessness of his anger, the mistake he made, and you can choose to save him. If you choose not to, you kill all the Aura too, and you go home. Hard stop. Maybe understandable after what they've put the kid through personally, but it stands for something cyclical, something brutal. If you choose instead to save Zulf, you put him on your back, and you walk through a hail of fire. It's actually pretty scary for a moment as your health dwindles and you wonder if Supergiant really has the nerve to kill you here and end their game. But instead, just as you teeter on the brink of death, the Aura stop shooting. They acknowledge the kid, pardon Zulf, and let them pass. And the kid returns to the Bastion with Zulf alive, and finally turns it on. And then immediately after comes the second choice, the ending choice. The Bastion doesn't fix the calamity, it erases it and turns back time. There's no telling if they'll remember what happened, what they've been through, or if they can even stop the calamity if they somehow do. It may be a cyclical hell they're already trapped in for all they know. The other option is to accept the loss and move on. The Bastion can launch into the horizon, evacuating the few survivors and giving them hope of a new life somewhere unaffected by their apocalypse. Now, we're friends here, and I've already explained everything else, so I'm just gonna tell you. The first ending, it's just New Game Plus. It's very clever, especially because it means you can do it again and again, and then choose the second ending whenever you're done and still experience it. But let's not be buzzkills and talk about how genuinely beautiful this choice is. Bastion is a very simple story about cyclical violence. You're purposely cut off from the meaning behind it. It's made out to be foreign to you. The beauty of the world you inhabit apparent only when it slowly comes together, the optimism baked into the atmosphere. You're constantly drowning in the feeling of something lost and the alien idea of why it ended up like this. Even if you immerse yourself in the flavor text and the backstory horde mode, you're subtly pushed toward the perspective that the kid himself just doesn't know much about his people's bad blood with the aura. And so led here with the option to stop it, you should, in theory, think it's best to go back and try. But you've already made one brutal choice, and it's an integral part of the second. Let's say you abandoned Zulf, killed the aura. Maybe you've decided they've done nothing to earn your sympathy, forced you, a victim in your own right, to restart the cycle of violence. Maybe you're tired of it. Maybe you just think the kid doesn't deserve the burden of being everyone's savior. Who's thanked him? Shown him they're willing to let go themselves. Maybe you believe you're being better than they were by choosing to move on. Or maybe it broke you. Maybe you feel more than ever that you have to avoid this. Maybe any amount, any number of a seemingly endless loop of suffering is worth erasing the calamity. Even if more war is inevitable, war is not apocalypse. But maybe you did save Zulf, right? Maybe you saw the one aura soldier who starts firing again. Maybe you saw his commanding officer kill him for it. Maybe you have hope. You believe that if you try again, there may be enough decency left to avoid mutual destruction. Maybe you just believe this is what was meant to happen, and your only power was to save the one person you were strong enough to save. 4 people left to try again somewhere else, to take the Bastion and learn to be better. Maybe it's preferable to any risk of the cycle continuing. Bastion's player choice, like the game itself, is a very small and delicate thing, and seemingly even shallow. But it's what you make of it, and for better or worse, it feels more like it belongs to you than any massive AAA project does, good ones and bad ones alike. And that it is a cycle, that there is no good or bad ending, just a cyclical and definite one. It doesn't take away from the story, from the choice. It doesn't mean you're a bad person for picking the wrong one, it just means you're not ready yet. And whether your reason is morally right or wrong is just a matter of perspective. It's so strong because this way the end, the real end, it's always waiting there in the wings. Because if the fate of Caelondia could be changed, the calamity could be prevented. But even if not, well, the kid was never not gonna make it here. It's not the end, it's the start, which is an apt metaphor for Supergiant. Bastion was a delayed success. It started off fine in sales with very good reviews, but it just grew and grew and grew and grew into a massive hit. It took a moment, but the people understood. They saw where this was going. Bastion, looking back, is a good game, but it's not that special, if that makes sense. It's proof. It's the precursor to what Supergiant could really be. The blueprint from which they built, the control to which they reacted and then evolved. I just don't think anyone thought they'd evolve so fucking fast. Going from making Bastion to making Transistor with only an extra 5 full-time employees is kind of like going from putting cinnamon and almond extract in your pancakes to making Michelin-starred beef Wellington when the only extra tools you have are a new stand mixer and a meat thermometer. Technically, you didn't need a whole new kitchen set, but still, how the fuck did you even do that? And that's not a knock on Bastion. I already said I like it. But to lay my biases on the table, I think Transistor is the best Supergiant game. In fact, I firmly believe it's one of the greatest games ever made. But the answer to how they did it, in fact, the unofficial motto for Transistor's development, is Crucible. I said in the beginning that even the seemingly creative utopia of Supergiant has had big problems that needed hashed out. Welcome to the problem child. The biggest problem off the bat, besides adding more creative voices in the pre-production stage, was Bastion. Supergiant's modus operandi is reactive development, but as the second project from this hot new studio, the earliest versions of Transistor suffered from a bit of a creative little brother complex. It's like when a band that's played together since high school releases their first album, and it's basically just polished versions of the best songs from 6 years worth of otherwise mid-demo tapes. Sure, that was gold, but now they're signed to a label, and they have 2 years max to write another album that's just as good, if not better. The fear of doing the same thing and the fear of not living up to their debut were in constant conflict, and the project was stuck in gridlock for over a year. So what happened then? Well, they went back to their roots. Vibes, baby. They went aesthetic first. See, in its original form, Transistor was not the story of Red. It was the story of that nameless boxer who's stuck in the sword. Red was the one who was essentially dead, and the boxer had a spirit guide who would have been the main voice of the game. But for some reason, it just wasn't fitting together. The sci-fi was far too grimdark, the characters were surprisingly uninteresting, and for the life of them, they couldn't figure out how to implement the elements of turn-based combat they wanted. That's when Greg and Jen got to talking about an old idea they had, a fantasy story about a woman whose wizard boyfriend gets stuck in a giant demon sword. And they thought to themselves, well hey, why don't we just kinda do that, but with this? It may not sound glamorous, but that is the creative process in action. Sometimes it just fucking clicks, and when Jen drew her first crack at Red with the Transistor, it was so awesome that everybody just got their shit together. No, seriously, the entire game just suddenly made sense when they flipped the roles, and once again, the aesthetic opened up the floodgates of story and design. Transistor is, in fact, the story of Red, a famous singer in the retro-futurist pseudo-matrix city of Cloudbank. Or she was, but sadly when you meet her, she's had her voice stolen by the Transistor, a glowing greatsword with the non-specific sci-fi magic power to absorb data, which in this world is also souls. I think. It's vague. Also, Red's murdered boyfriend is impaled with it right next to her. His nickname during pre-production and in the game's code is Auden. So I'm calling him Auden. Auden's consciousness is trapped inside the Transistor, but he can still talk to Red. He becomes her guide and the narrator. What makes him interesting as one, compared at least to Rux, is his personal relationship with Red. They reminisce, they interact. Even though Red can't talk, you can feel the connection. It's a one-way conversation, and Red's input is up to your understanding of their dynamic, interrupted only occasionally with splash pages that at least show off her facial expressions. And, of course, her music. Every song in the game is, within the universe, one of Red's actual songs. As you traverse the early stages of the game, attacked everywhere you go by the process, it adds this extra layer of melancholy to Red's journey through a dying place. A deep-seated desire to take something back. All you can do for now is hope that it's the city itself. Darren Korb has talked a lot about how difficult it was to piece together Transistor's score. It had to sound as though they were all real songs she wrote, fit the roaring 20s meets 1980s Tokyo aesthetic around Cloudbank, and still somehow retroactively add something to the present state of Red's journey. She's out for revenge first and foremost, but the city is dying, the process chewing up buildings and people alike and spitting out decoded polygonal husks of the once vibrant architecture. Red is alone, everything she loved is rapidly disappearing, and the clock is ticking. Retrieving her voice and her partner, completely pointless if there's no time left to escape. So did he pull it off, you're probably wondering? Well, yes, obviously. In fact, so much more than that. But this is Supergiant, so of course I can't explain the music without talking about the gameplay. Jesus, where to even start on this one? Unlike Bastion, Transistor's gameplay is very, very linear. There is no hub, and as far as what to do when, there is no choice. Instead, the gameplay is just significantly deeper. The key is the transistor, in a lot of ways, but let's start with how it affects the player choice. Once it was added to the concept and fully replaced Auden's spirit guide, the transistor became everything. The guide, the tool, the weapon. One that can control Cloudbank, albeit only in short bursts. The implementation of turn-based combat was condensed into a singular, literal mechanic called turn, a brief stoppage of time in which Red can plan out and execute limited movement and attacks with no reaction from the process. That probably sounds kinda cool and that's it, but I promise you, it adds so much depth that the gameplay around it had to be redesigned to compensate. The combat of Transistor is oppressive. The process is constantly evolving, and they really don't fuck around. They fight like Dark Souls bosses. They don't do as much damage, but that doesn't really matter that much when you have to just sit there and take it anyway. There's no dodge, no block, just the functions of the Transistor. Red's not a fighter like Auden, she's a singer. Her only choice is to figure out how the transistor works. Remember when I said there's 132 different combinations of weapons in Bastion, plus the specials? Well, Transistor has a lot more slots, and every function does something new depending on where you put it. There are, and this is straight from Amir Rao because I didn't want to do the math, over 3,000 different loadouts available to the fully unlocked Transistor, and they all do shit. Experimentation is necessary, and as you pull trace data from your dead acquaintances around Cloudbank, you'll be forced to pick which new functions to take, which slots to unlock, and you better pray you figure it out fast, because there's probably a new freaky-looking process monster right around the corner. Stasis isn't just the only way to survive in this game, it very quickly becomes a running theme. The anachronistic nostalgia of Cloudbank, the constant feeling of something lost, the search for pockets of quiet and empty, they're all, of course, related. They all embody the need for control, question the point of it, explore the cost of insatiable demand and the irony of stagnation. This is why the music is so important in Transistor, more than probably any other Supergiant game. With no voice, Red's character has to come through in the music, and for that reason, the score is adaptive. Like a little bit, anyway. Every song in the game is, again, technically one of Red's songs, so she knows them, of course. They represent her frame of mind at the time they play, even the ones without lyrics. If you hold down a certain button, she'll just stop wherever she is and hum along to calm herself. The focus fades, and a little spotlight falls on her. It's a nice way to allow the player to reminisce for her, to take a break and just appreciate what's left of Cloudbank. But there's more to it. Whenever Red uses the turn function to stop time, the soundtrack slips into a reverbed, distant version of the song where she's humming as if you're inside her head. The sandbox allows you to pick whatever song you want so long as you have it unlocked. Maybe that has more to do with Sybil than Red, but yeah, it adds to the feeling that this is the one place Red can take back control. And personally, I could listen to it and stare at the sunset visualizer for hours. Sometimes, I genuinely use it as a background when we have company, so, thanks for that one, Supergiant. So much of the heavy lifting is done by the atmosphere of Transistor, and really it's because the story is so ambiguous. In fact, if there's anything to complain about, I'd say it's not for everyone, this story, because of how vague it can be. It doesn't take long for Red to discover that the Camerata, the cabal at the top of Cloudbank's food chain who tried to murder her, are also in charge of the process. Or they were, until they botched her assassination, and now without the Transistor, they can't control the process. While the process destroys the city, Red hunts down the Camerata, one by one. Sybil, who becomes corrupted by the process, and that's a boss fight. The Kendrels, who have the decency at least to admit to the populace they were the ones who doomed the city, and then they commit before Red can get her hands on them. And then last is Royce. By this point, you've been on a linear path of increasing difficulty, experimentation, and collecting lore. The Camerata failed in their hubris, but the people aren't entirely innocent. It's probably too late to undo any of this anyway. All Red can hope for is to escape before the process clean out the entire city. But Royce is still alive, and he has a proposition for you. This is probably the best place to mention that while it's a bit of a controversial performance, I think Royce's voice actor fucking killed it. His voice and cadence are so tired, so detached, so curious, and yet fatalistic. It's engrossing to hear his passing, fanciful thoughts on the powers he played God with and the world he destroyed because of it. Which is good, because his quiet radio voice dumps subtle but undeniable exposition on you from every corner of the frame, the entire brutal trek back to the empty husk of Fairview. The process have always built the city. The transistor Royce just happened to stumble across. They use it to control the process. They killed people with it to absorb their functions, or sometimes just to kill them, which is probably more what they wanted Red for. Except Sybil, who wanted to kill Red's boyfriend because she was obsessed with Red. That's actually how come the story happened. All that said, if they plug the transistor back into the cradle, they can send the process away. Probably. Nobody, not even Royce, knows what the transistor actually is. They're a real chicken and egg type, the transistor and the process, but it does seem like the process are supposed to stay inside of it. And now, before we meet Royce, I do have to talk about limiters. I know, I'm really out of order, I'm sorry. They add lore, but I don't have time for that. I'm spending too long on Transistor, you see. The limiters are, at their core, just a difficulty mechanic. Supergiant doesn't do difficulty settings. They do handicaps, and they do them very well. Transistor introduced this idea, started their obsession with Eat Your Vegetables game design, perfecting user experience by making challenge part of user choice. The limiters demand new ideas and reward the player with both experience boosts and story nuggets. Pyre and Hades both implemented similar ideas, and it's just, like, it has to be pointed out. I don't know where it had to go, but this is the time I'm taking for it. It's difficulty perfected. Everyone should do this. And it kinda brings us back to Royce. When Red finally reaches Royce, they dock the transistor immediately, and suddenly, the process is gone. It's so easy, it probably should have happened way earlier. But it isn't that simple. The reaction drags both Royce and Red into the transistor, and only one of them can get out. The fight with Royce is absolutely fucking perfect. The sudden shock of him actually using the turn function of his own transistor, it turns the entire game on its head. The process is relentless and blazing fast. Fighting them encourages movement options, creativity, and stealth. If you walk into the fight with Royce with only one actual attack, like I did, you're probably gonna lose. One last demand for experimentation, a pure game of chess. That's what this boss fight is. Red has spent this entire story learning how the transistor works, and now she has to prove she's the rightful owner. This fight rules, and when you win it, you'd think Royce would be at peace, finally getting to see what's inside the transistor he spent so much of his life obsessing over. But death is death, and the last thing you hear from him is the same dreadful panic as everyone that's ever been sucked into it. Red wakes up in the remains of Cloudbank and rebuilds Fairview along with Auden's body. But it's just a body. It's already been made clear. She can't take him out of the transistor. There's no one left, at all. There's no point in rebuilding Cloudbank. Painting a portrait of the past on a canvas, nothing more. Auden pleads, but Red's mind is made up. She sits down with him and impales herself with the transistor. The thing about Transistor, what makes it so many people's favorite, is that its melancholy is so beautiful, it makes you forget that it's about loss. Its confounding mixed metaphors about creation and afterlife and reality are so hard to parse, it frustrates a lot of people. But I think it's on purpose. It's impossible to tell if Cloudbank is a Matrix world and the country is real, or if it's just sci-fi flavored magical realism and they're effectively in heaven, or just in the transistor, which seems the most likely, but what it means in the greater picture, the role of the transistor and the process in a practical sense, I don't think it really matters that much. These mixed metaphors fit together into a comprehensive, if ultimately open to interpretation, story about the meaning of presence. Reunited with Auden, given back the gift of her voice, it's clear Red is, by the standards of this universe, more alive than she was dragging a glowing broadsword across the carcass of an ever-changing and therefore never-changing facsimile of a city. Nothing in Transistor is constant, except these two, together. Exactly 3 games have ever left me sitting on my couch, speechless, emotionally short-circuiting until my partner got sick of staring at the title screen and put on RuPaul's Drag Race. Nier Automata, God of War Ragnarok, and Transistor. The difference is Transistor cost me $5 on sale. That's like if a Starbucks coffee changed your fucking life. Anyway, now let's do Pyre. The first thing you notice about Pyre is that the voice actors don't speak English, or any real modern language for that matter. They speak gibberish, translated in large paper text boxes at the bottom of the screen. My God, you think to yourself, they went and made a visual novel. It's a testament to the control over their medium Supergiant has developed at this point, how immediately and starkly you can ascertain that this is a choose-your-own-adventure story. And of course, because it's Supergiant and they have to flex, one very much about storytelling in itself. But that's probably when you notice the second thing about Pyre, that the actual gameplay is really weird. Let's back up. Pyre was the experimental leap the studio had earned the right to take after 2 straight slam dunks. It sought to both prioritize and yet actively marry 2 of Supergiant's most stalwart but underappreciated design themes: player choice and player failure. The question behind Pyre was surprisingly simple. What if there was an RPG where it didn't matter if you lost? Of course, simple and easy are 2 very different things. What the team knew right away is that they wanted to establish a more comprehensive and professional development process, and with so much success behind them, they were free to truly experiment. They wanted a party system with lots of characters, a warmer, more optimistic story, and a high fantasy setting. All great ideas, meaningful choices, and yet a forgiving story system that doesn't punish losing. Ambitious, but certainly possible. We'll circle back, says management, but we still need some kind of glue to hold that plot together. Something that can dominate the design principles, especially in regards to gameplay. Any ideas? Management asks. A sheepish hand rises from the middle ranks. You guys ever play NBA Jam? That's probably not how it actually happened, but Pyre's development was a very unique field of quagmires. Player choice is always a tricky rhyme to rock, but choose-your-own adventures are positively brutal. The challenge of Pyre was to create a story that could accommodate consistent player failure, but also design engaging, interactive gameplay that would add dimensions to player choice. Precedent in this venture was slim at best. Visual novels tend to pick between choice or active gameplay sections. Telltale Games is good at writing, but they don't exactly push the limits of meaningful player choice. And I mean, not to be outright mean to Supermassive and Quantic Dream, but...
It's about time. See. This is what it looks like.
Pyre was an absolute undertaking, and the evident answer was to risk stitching together wildly different ideas that absolutely could not be tested without a shitload of work being done in advance. The first was a party system that forced you to retire party members permanently. The second was a miniature sports league. No, really. This way, the story itself would have a loop of its own, and in theory, so long as the code could take all the weight, player choices and even failures would have hard markers to reset options at. And so, again, in theory, the player would be telling their own story in the most literal way ever attempted. So who are you, player? You are the reader, a nameless exile of the corrupt and turmoiled Commonwealth, cast into the downside, a mystical purgatory from which there is actually, conveniently, some return. You see, you have the very magic power of being literate. Everybody in the downside is a dumb idiot who can't read, and your arrival beckons the legendary Nightwings, the Harlem Globetrotters of the downside. Once every, let's say, month, because I forgot the star cycle they operate on, the Nightwings used to challenge the strongest group of outcasts available in a ceremonial rite, with one member of the winning group being offered redemption and return to the Commonwealth. It's a big deal, and for the last god knows how long, the Nightwings have had no reader, and so the rites haven't happened, and everyone's just been stuck in the downside watching the clock because there's no hope of getting out. Congratulations, you've already saved the day. Now that the Nightwings are awakened and the liberation rites can begin again, it's time to play some basketball. Yes, really, that's basically the gameplay loop of Pyre. Every week, the team bus heads toward the place on the map where whatever team you want to play against is waiting for you, collect some buffs or visit the shop or bond in these little Fire Emblem support-style conversations, and then you have your right against the team you chose to play. The rights themselves are 3-on-3 games of League of Legends basketball. There are mild combat elements and deaths and respawns, but at the end of the day, you're fighting over a big glowing ball and dunking it into each other's fires in an effort to put them out. Does it work? Yeah, better than it should, at least. In a vacuum, I would describe Pyre's gameplay as serviceable at best, but it's hard to separate the rights from their purpose to the story, so it's hard to criticize them. You might say the minigames in a Danganronpa trial are boring, but you don't need them. They don't add anything. They're just there for the sheer sake of engagement. Pyre's rights are vital to the story, in the fact that they're kind of not. See, each cycle has a certain number of rights in it, and as the Nightwings, it doesn't actually matter if you win. You're the control group, said the ancient scribes, and so you always get to go to the liberation rite. The incentive to win is effectively just story-based. You get less experience if you lose, and your team doesn't bond as much. The balance is to experiment so you can guarantee you'll win the liberation rights, versus keeping your favorites so you learn more about them. There are numerous character archetypes who have wildly different styles as combatants in the rite. You'll find some make a lot more sense to you than others. The Moontouch girl was a real dominant player for me. If you pick the right upgrades, she basically just Jordan hops across the entire stage. But here's the thing about that. Sooner or later, that wins you a liberation rite. And then somebody has to go home. Like any other, you take a team of 3 into the liberation rite, and if you win, one of those 3 has to be liberated. Pyre's gameplay loop is all about investment and then sacrifice. If you love the way a character plays, you're incentivized to keep them around. But the thing about the rights is that they're running out, and nobody knows how many cycles are left. If you don't let your favorite party member go home, you risk trapping them in the downside for the rest of their lives. If you ship them off, on the other hand, you risk losing rights, and then maybe fewer of your party members can be liberated overall. How do you decide who deserves redemption? Is it about bonds? Is it about performance? Is it about the revolution? What's that you say? I didn't talk about the revolution? Well, fuck. Okay, back up again. Remember how I said the Commonwealth sucks? Well, the Nightwings are well aware, and their former leader has a plan to start a revolt led by the returned exiles. And oops, oh no, if you don't liberate enough Nightwings, the revolution probably isn't going to go so hot. It sounds like a pointless additional mechanic, but you need reasons to win. Everyone out here is an exile with a tragic backstory, and if you and your new friends are just having a great time dominating your intramural basketball league, you may feel inclined to throw a game or two to the sad sacks who've been stuck on the Washington Generals for decades. The character writing is the backbone of Pyre. It had to be so strong that it might actually affect your decision-making. It had to create difficult, no-win situations. Your choices matter, TM, in video games, it's a myth. It's fairy dust. Even Telltale, the only guys who even do it half well, still more or less just disguise a coin flip between the planned story path and a short detour featuring an additional punishment for choosing wrong. I'm not here to call out choose-your-own-adventure games, it's just the hard truth. That shit requires mountains of backup code. It just can't actually change that much without being like 400 gigabytes and $200 market price. What Pyre sought to do in lieu of wasting your time with branching and then re-merging paths and superficial replayability was to simply accommodate any amount of failure and make all the meaning up to you. This is what I mean when I say that Pyre is a story about storytelling. Supergiant's approach to interactivity has always been a little inverted. But Pyre is a game in which your experience is the only thing that makes the story work. You're the reader. Do you get it? You're followed by bards, and aside from their songs, the only real language-speaking voice you hear is the Archbishop, your absolute opposite. It's a war of perspectives, him telling your story and you telling your story, and your choices, your actions, are the only thing you have power over. His reaction and your own thoughts on the events that follow are entirely up to interpretation as, like any other game in its genre, the plot of Pyre more or less moves along undisturbed. The difference is that Pyre doesn't have any real interest in telling you what's right or wrong. Reward and punishment are abstracts only you can measure. They were prepared for anything. In fact, the soundtrack, which is effectively packed with ballads, has to be flexible in its own right, requiring a wacky system of hard markers and up to 6 separate tracks within the audio files, just to accommodate different versions of the actual retelling of your story. Seriously, there's like hundreds of permutations of the end credits song because it tells everyone's story one by one. This obsession with accommodating player choice, even at the expense of stakes, is what makes Pyre so unique and maybe so niche. Full disclosure, again, you know what you signed up for. Almost nothing matters in the entire game if you boil it down. You can lose every right, and you still go to the liberation rites. You can lose those too, though. Every single one. Never liberate a single one of your own party members. The revolution still happens. It's a disaster, but eventually, the Commonwealth falls. Each and every choice you make means nothing, because there's no game over, no forced restart. But that's what makes them mean something. The average player doesn't know what each choice will do, how everyone will react, how many exiles they can save even if they win every single right in the entire game. Supergiant risked experimenting with a completely, unequivocally, shamelessly personalized design philosophy. Some games you play just to experience the story. In Pyre, the story is the experience. It's the whole game, the motivation, the reward, the punishment, the meaning inherent. There's only one ending, and yet there's dozens, because every choice affects the lives of every character you ever meet. In fact, there's no New Game Plus. There can't be, because it defeats the exploratory nature of the player's role. Pyre was, in theory, a game that could, even maybe should, be played over and over, but ironically, most players didn't see any reason to. When you tell your own story, you tell it once, and you tell it right. That's the core concession of Pyre. There's no good or bad ending, not really. There's only who you were and what you did. The lives you touched for better or for worse. The art, the music, the atmosphere, it's all just as spectacular as Supergiant's fans had come to expect in their third game, but Pyre's design was something entirely new. It represented a new philosophy, an experience that was infallibly accessible, specifically to make a point about the importance of storytelling and the beauty of will. Quite a load to bear for a visual novel with an NBA Jam minigame, but that's what makes Pyre some people's favorite Supergiant game. It's not just different, it's proudly unusual. It bucks traditional ideas in the name of exploring the limits of interactivity. It wants more than anything to prove that you deserve control, that meaning is what you make of it, and that if they're trusted with the tools necessary to immerse themselves, anyone can tell their own story. I like Pyre a lot. It's an achievement among achievements, a rousing success you rarely see even in mildly experimental media. I don't love Pyre like I love Transistor, but I deeply respect what Supergiant did to make it work. The hours they had to put into building a system that couldn't be tested. The absolute balls on them to create an interactive experience meant to be conditional and yet definitive. And so, of course, it only stands to reason that they'd follow it up with the exact fucking opposite. Pyre's original concept was to be effectively procedural in its narrative. It evolved into something more concrete, and ultimately players proved to consider it a singular experience. For each person, there was only one Pyre. With Hades, Supergiant said, no, get your heads out of your asses, you pretentious idiots. These games take us 3 years to make. You're gonna play this one till your hands fall off. A roguelike, Supergiant brand, procedural design. What could it possibly mean? What else but a whole new system nobody has even thought to attempt in 30 plus years of video game development? The key behind Hades was open access development. Supergiant wanted to involve their fans in the dev process to ensure they would make the best game possible. And so the very concept of opening up the story and the gameplay little by little drove the design of Hades in a very practical sense. A game with immediate accessibility, but infinite replayability. What does that sense of so easy to grasp and yet so dense in its subject matter call to mind? I, too, thought of the Fast and Furious franchise, but they chose mythology, and in their defense, it is cheaper to get the rights. Hades was originally Minos, a similar story of escaping a labyrinth, but starring Theseus and the Bull of Minos. The problem with that was simple. When the Minotaur gores your pathetic human ribcage, you tend to stay dead. The crushing permanence of death does not make for a good roguelike, so old Greg went hunting through his Rolodex of Greek myths and found Zagreus, the likely proto-avatar of Dionysus, but who some believe to have been worshipped as the son of Hades. Now there's a guy who canonically won't stay dead. So they had their new strategy, an open access development of a roguelike isometric action game with mild RPG elements, featuring a cast of heart-stoppingly sexy Greek gods who all hate each other and need to learn to get along. Slowly. Now comes the insane innovation, because a good idea is never enough here. Now, my understanding of coding is no better than a dog's understanding of, well, coding, really. It's witchcraft to me. So I'm going to explain this as simply as I can, and hopefully I'm at least technically right. The dialogue of Hades operates on a much more complicated version of the branching narrative system of Pyre. Over 10 fucking hours of dialogue was recorded, and there is a system of chain events that open and select dialogue options based on your recent actions and position along the timeline of the overarching story. Now, that probably doesn't sound like much, and it's probably because I don't really get it. But what it means is that in this small roguelike with a cast of 20 speaking characters, it takes most players over 100 hours of gameplay to even have a solid chance of hearing repeated dialogue. And that's if you even remember every conversation you've had. And why bother? Because like every Supergiant game, it helps Hades marry intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Hades is a game about Hades, the place, not the guy. Hades the place is where Zagreus lives, and Hades the guy is his deadbeat dad. Zagreus wants to get out of Hades the place and find his mom Persephone. That's it. For a long time. Because Hades the place is not an easy place to get out of, and Hades the dad is a really bad dad. So repairing your relationship while you slowly repair his palace physically and raise hell all over hell. I'm on fucking fire today, aren't I? Anyway, it's a roguelike. You do the same loop, but slightly different a bunch of times in a row. Now here's the thing. This game right here, Hades, the game from Supergiant Games, it's so much goddamn fun. The core gameplay loop of Hades is absolutely electric. It's a similar isometric action setup to Bastion, but as a semi-procedural dungeon crawler, and if it was blistering fast. Each weapon allows a vastly different experience, both dealing with hordes and with bosses. Each tree of boons from your distant cousins, the Mount Olympus gods, add 1 to 3 layers of extra variety. You collect these boons as you work your way up the numerous layers of hell, adding massive perks to your arsenal of moves that range from basic critical bonuses to wacky stuff like ricocheting lightning bolts and everything in between, or sometimes together when 2 gods decide to work in concert. There's a magic mirror in your room full of other perks you can purchase to change the odds of certain boons, give you extra lives, even slightly rearrange the dungeon as you go. There's also, eventually, a challenge scroll in the prep room with another laundry list of difficulty modifiers, because Supergiant is addicted to tailoring your experience. It's so much it's legitimately overwhelming. But the cool thing is, every option is viable. Every way to play the game can and will work. And none of them ever feel too difficult to master or too broken to use as a crutch. The variation of playstyles is officially incalculable at this point, and regardless of your comfort zone, experimentation is literally necessary to advance the story. You don't just need to do runs and succeed to get further, you need to talk to everyone. Hades is a game about dysfunction and connection, and since the gameplay gimmick is that with every run you objectively become stronger, the story gimmick is that with every death your dialogue options expand and your filial bonds become stronger too. Hades' palace is in disrepair, and since he's as bad a leader as he is a father, it's your job to fix it. This means chatting up your employees and friends and loved ones, building connections, unlocking perks, and of course, getting laid. Is it very cool representation that you can romance both Megara and Thanatos? Yes. Are Supergiant a bunch of cowards for making Dusa swerve you? Absolutely. Do not question my weird taste, Greg. Let me love the anxious floating snakehead monster. And Hypno, he's such a cutie. And Nyx. I know she's Zagreus' surrogate mother, but she's not mine. Which brings me, rather tastefully, to the art. Inspired by the nude heroic art of, obviously, ancient Greece, the portraits of the gods in Hades are, for lack of a better turn of phrase, alarmingly sexy. The environments are beautiful, achingly realized considering how wildly they knew you'd be bouncing around them, and the music. You know the music is good. From Western proto-hip-hop to dark vapor jazz to high fantasy folk, what could possibly have been next from Darren Korb but Mediterranean? This soundtrack goes so hard, it's above my pay grade to describe. Except for when you stumble onto Eurydice. This I must try. I'm honestly just on a proper tangent at this point, but I simply couldn't go the whole entire video without talking about Ashley Barrett. Ashley Barrett is Supergiant's resident female vocalist. She doesn't write the music, but she's been singing with Darren since Bastion. And if you've never played a single Supergiant game, first off, thanks for sitting through this video anyway. But secondly, what you need to understand is how important Ashley Barrett's voice is to this company. This is why we're talking about her in Hades and not Transistor. The first time you stumble upon Eurydice, you are truly not expecting it. You're probably exhausted, near death, petrified by the freaky jumping monsters in Asphodel and the new dimensions they add to your flickering eye line. But then you hear it. This muffled voice, singing. Eurydice's kitchen, quite literally, stops you in your tracks. Her voice is so earth-shatteringly beautiful, her song so sincere and emotional, you are compelled to stop and listen to it. It's actively relieving, soothing. It makes you reflect on your hardship and feel her longing through your own. I am not a music expert, but I am inclined to assume Darren Korb and Ashley Barrett were put on this earth to work together. Her voice isn't just pretty, it's arresting, hypnotic. It oozes out of the screen and wraps you in their collective vision. There's a reason Supergiant never truly dropped their habit of allowing the aesthetics to come first. Atmosphere, detail, moments of surprisingly, profoundly emotional impact designed to push you deeper into the story, no matter how badly your lizard brain wants to think about gameplay. Eurydice's introduction is a microcosm of Supergiant's design philosophy. Every voice matters, no matter their contributions, because any individual contribution can completely change a player's experience, and the right experience is its own reward. And then, of course, Eurydice stays there, ready for you whenever you stumble upon her home, because someone like me might always want to stop, just to listen. Also, she gives you more perks. The beauty of Hades is how organically connected the intense gameplay and surprisingly cute story are. Hades itself is packed with people to talk to, and their stories follow you back to the palace and/or out into the climb. Connections you make and perks you choose encourage you to try to explore new options to escape, making you stronger and constantly feeding the theme of repairing connections. No matter how fun any given roguelike is, eventually the loop gets tiring. Hades kind of doesn't, not just because it's fucking endless with all the options, but because the story just keeps going. Even when you beat the final boss, which is your dad, Hades the guy, obviously, that wasn't what the story was about. Persephone isn't what the story was about. So when you finally meet her and then die because Zagreus can't survive outside Hades, it's now a whole new problem. How many times can you get past Hades to finish your conversation with Persephone? It's actually pretty funny fighting through hundreds if not thousands of your father's minions just to make it to tea time with mom. It turns the game on its head, no longer about progressing to become stronger, but instead to figure out the most efficient way to burn through the underworld and have another few sentences of progress on Earth. Hades is about relationships, and so the real goal is to reconnect your parents. Except it's not, because once you do that, you still have more family. Eventually, Zagreus repairs his relationship with his father and becomes a full-time employee, testing the limits of Hades' security by breaking out every day just to prove it's not good enough. Hilarious, adorable, mom's home, you're in a totally healthy polyamorous relationship with your two mega-hot childhood friends. But what about all those other gods that still hate Hades and think Zagreus is trapped and Persephone is a slave? We gotta get the whole family together and kiss and make up, right? Yes, unironically, you do. The endgame achievement is called Family Reunion. This game figuratively never ends, and it's fine because the gameplay loop simply does not get tiring. It's a very different experience than every other Supergiant game, one built around your experience as a player of the video game, not as a subject of the story. It's still interactive in a very special way. It's still a masterclass in commanding the craft, as aesthetically pleasing as it is emotionally affecting, as it is viscerally entertaining, but it's meant to be experienced in as many different ways as possible. They inverted their system, this time without compromise, instead of allowing you to subtly create your own story, forcing you to overtly slap this one against the wall until it works. In this sense, Hades is more a game of the people. It's not as artsy-fartsy, and despite the mind-melting creative complexity of the dialogue system, it is still just dialogue-based bonding mechanics that drive the story. That doesn't mean it's not great, it is, but it was time for Supergiant to make a game for the masses, in their own way. Did it work? Well, here's a stat. Transistor took over a year to sell 1 million copies. Hades took 3 days. That number is skewed because over 2/3 of those first million sales actually happened during early access, but you get the point. Huge sales on Hades, massive acclaim, and while Supergiant was effectively already a household name in 2020, Hades broke the goddamn internet. I have no idea how many people played every Supergiant game because they liked Hades so much, but I can tell you the mania was enough to change even their very corporate ethos. Can you believe it, viewer? It's true. After over 10 years and 4 distinct masterworks, Supergiant has finally sold out. Make no mistake, viewer, I am on pins and needles for this game. I also doubt that money and acclaim were actually behind Supergiant's decision to finally make a sequel. Hades was a massive hit, but it was also, in a way, a first effort. Inviting users into their development was both exciting and educational. They built a new engine and shifted their design focus to experimental user experience. It's pretty easy to look at Hades and see it as the next logical step for a team of ambitious RPG fans running out of archetypes, but it comes from a completely different creative place than the first 3 Supergiant games. Your role in the interactive meta dynamic is reversed. It's not about you anymore. The story is not what you make of it. It's just a goal, and your job is to build the entire path. As amazing as Hades was, it's pretty obvious these guys can do it better, and it seems like their new plan is just to prove it. They've already promised a bigger, more complex world with even more ways to play, and they're right back at it with a plan for early access development. Hades 2 may actually take Supergiant more than the normal 3 years to develop, but hey, why not buck every tradition at once? None of these are moves that should or will upset anyone. I cannot stress enough how much I'm kidding when I say these guys sold out. What makes Supergiant truly special is their physical inability to rest on their laurels. Their entire fan base, now easily in the millions, knows full well that any decision they make has a reason behind it. A sequel, you say? Looking forward to it. More time? Boy howdy, they must be cooking up one hell of a system. It's a symbiotic relationship because it eases the pressure on the studio and guarantees them freedom because they know we'll play anything they make no matter what. So what do we get out of it? We get great fucking video games, time and time again, without fail, as long as this team stays together. And we get them for less than half the price of a AAA game. The existence of Supergiant, the sheer quality of their catalog, is a testament to the power of respect. When an employer respects their employees, it promotes innovation. When creators respect their audience, it fosters trust and multiplies engagement. And when an audience respects the hard work of the artists who share their vision with the world, it breeds ambition. And so the cycle goes on. The only good cycle in Supergiant stories. Ironic, isn't it? Stranger than fiction, or whatever the saying is. Here's hoping, no, knowing, that Hades 2 will be even better, more successful, and more fulfilling than its predecessors. And since there's room for it then, here's hoping you still get to fuck.